Okay, for this lesson we're looking at working in time with two different locations. There was a question very similar to the kind of questions we expect here in the previous lesson, and there's not a great deal that is changing between what we learnt last lesson and this one. I think the questions will just will require you to do a bit more conversions. So obviously international time zones can be used to locate to calculate local time in two different locations and solve issues regarding travelling time or when to hold a conference or what time you need to wake up in order to watch the Tour de France, although I don't think we'll be having that this year. So you find your two locations. Once again, use a timeline. I think it's the strongest way to do it, and then you do your subtraction. And just be careful about whether or not the day changes. So we've got a situation here where Patrick is working in Seoul and needs to travel to Chicago. So we just do our little timeline. At 0, we're going to have Greenwich or London. And then 9 hours in front is going to be Seoul. And 6 hours behind is going to be Chicago. Now, obviously, that means that this is the time difference I'm concerned with. And as I said in the previous lesson, if you just take the most easterly and take away from it the most westerly, so the time difference is just going to be 9 minus, and remember it's minus 6. And when we minus a minus, it becomes a positive. So it would be 9 plus 6, which is 15 hours. Okay. So what is the time then in Chicago when it's 5 p.m. in Seoul? So easiest thing to do with this is convert 5 p.m. into 24-hour time. I find these are a bit easier to do in 24-hour time. So 5 p.m. is 1700. And so if we want to know when it's 1700 in Seoul, it's going to be 15 hours earlier in Chicago because Seoul is ahead of Chicago. So we take away 15 hours and we end up with 2 o'clock, which is also 2 a.m., just so we understand that. So if Patrick leaves Seoul at 5 p.m. and takes a 14-hour flight, what time does he arrive in Chicago? So, well, we already know that Seoul 5 p.m. equals Chicago 2 a.m. So we just need to add 14 hours. So therefore, 2 o'clock plus 14-hour flight gives us 1600, which is the same as 4 p.m. So he leaves Seoul at 5 p.m. and he arrives in Chicago at 4 p.m. And that's how that works. So he actually leaves before he arrives. It's quite common when you're travelling that way. I once left Australia and we're going for Canada and arrived, I think, 5 hours before I left. So Mona is planning a trip from Suva in Fiji to Miami in Florida. What is the time difference between those cities? Well, once again, we draw ourselves a little timeline. 0 is going to be London. In this case, Florida is at -5. And Suva in Fiji is at +12. So once again, we're looking to find that distance. So our time difference is just going to be 12 minus -5, which is going to be 17 hours. So the next question is, what time and day is it in Miami if it's 10:10 on Wednesday the 6th of January in Suva? So what we've essentially got is 10:10 a.m., which we can display in 24-hour time exactly the same way, 10:10. If it's 10:10 in Suva, then Miami's behind Suva, so the time there is 17 hours earlier. And if we use our calculator for this, it's not a bad little way of doing it. If I put this into my calculator, so 10 hours, 10 minutes minus 17 hours, we're going to get -6 hours and 50 minutes. Now that doesn't make a lot of sense, but what that essentially means is we're basically, therefore, we are 6 hours, 50 minutes before midnight. So if we think about that, we can use our calculator and go, well, midnight is basically at 24 hours if we're going backwards, and we can take away 6 hours and 50 minutes, and we're left with 17:10. Which is in 24-hour time, and if we want to convert that to AM and PM, it's 5:10 PM. But of course, because we've gone before midnight, that means we're also gone to a different day. It's now Tuesday. Tuesday the 5th of the 1st, because of course Wednesday was the 6th of the 1st in the question. And the last example here we've got is a past HSC question. This is quite a difficult sort of one. Not too hard, but just requires a little bit of thinking. The best way I would do, the thing I would do first is get everything into one time zone. So I'm going to move New Delhi time into Brisbane time, and that's going to be a little bit easier. So we've got this flight, the time in Brisbane is 4.5 hours ahead of New Delhi, so we know that. And we've got John flying from New Delhi to Brisbane via Singapore. He's left at 11:30 AM, stopped along the way in Singapore for 3 hours, and then he's arrived at Brisbane at 9 o'clock the following day. So the first things first, well, let's figure out what New Delhi is. So 11:30, well, sorry, what time, when it's 11:30 in New Delhi, what time is that in Brisbane? So 11:30 in New Delhi plus 4 hours and 30 minutes is going to give us a Brisbane time. Not a Brisbane, a Brisbane. And so when we add those two together, we get 1600. So 11:30 plus 4 hours and 30 minutes is going to get us up to 1600, which is basically 4 PM, and you can kind of see that from there anyway. So basically we've left at 4 PM, or actually we call it 1600, it'll be a little bit easier, 1600 Brisbane time, and we've arrived at 900 Brisbane time, but that's the next day. Okay, so that means our total time elapsed is going to be the time up until midnight, so from 4 o'clock till midnight, that's 8 hours, and then the time past midnight, which is the 9 hours till 9 o'clock, so therefore 17 hours. So in other words, 17 hours has passed since, what's this person? John left New Delhi, but he didn't just go straight there. I want to know his total flying time, so his flying time is going to equal that 17 hours minus the 3 hours stopover. So therefore he flies for 14 hours. So he's travelling for 17, but he's only flying for 14 of those hours. So have a crack at those questions that are there. I would really strongly suggest you draw yourself a little picture for most of them. Being in a little timeline, it's the easiest way to ensure you're not going to make any mistakes. It makes it easy to see what you're supposed to be doing. Make sure you're posting your questions, the answers to your questions, up onto OneNote or into a shared Google Drive, folder, if you can't get OneNote to work. And remember, we have a Zoom session on Friday. Oh, although if this is the other maths class, your Zoom session will be a different time. So the small maths class, your Zoom session is on Friday. By the time the larger math class sees this, there'll possibly be a different Zoom session organised. So sorry about the confusion. All right, have a good weekend, folks.